standing here beneath an incredibly amazing tree. This is the Bunya pine. So the Bunya pine is a very good example, and we've used it previously in this course to explain regional specialisation and also a massive yield that's very periodic. So the Bunya tree, for example, and we're fortunate because we're actually able to capture this footage now because there's a 3-year interval between the harvest or the boon harvest of nuts that this incredible tree produces and the next fruiting of that same nut. So capturing it is a challenge. This is a tree that's well known to the old people in this southeast Queensland region where I'm filming today. It was a tree of incredible repute, both with the traditional indigenous owners and custodians of this land, but also the pioneers who quickly tapped into its many benefits. Now it's another example of an anecdotal handing down of knowledge and fragmentary handing down of that knowledge. We know how it was eaten, we know that we can do that now, and it's anecdotally safe to do so. In fact, it's very beneficial. But in terms of scientific research to verify what potential benefits at a nutritional level or a medicinal level this particular tree offers to humanity, it's still very, very undiscovered, unresearched, and with only a very limited amount of knowledge being pursued in that particular direction. If you are a regular frequenter of resource bases like PubMed, you might come across 1 or 2 articles of research involving this particular tree, and those are centered around its essential oil content, particularly from the nut itself. So we're very, very much in a space of anecdotal knowledge on this particular species. So that all said, this is one of my all-time favorite plant species. Practically living amongst a Bunya forest, a Bunya region, and guys like this that I planted 10 odd years ago are now starting to come into a season of adolescence. But all around this very region that we're in, there are ancient trees that are well over 60, 70, 100 years old, and they fruit in this 3-year cycle. There's some limited fruiting in between, but it's every 3 years or so we get a boon harvest. Now, the product of that harvest is what makes the Bunya pine so famous. So that harvest involves these. This is the Bunya pine cone, or the Bunya nut. It's colloquially referred to both ways, but it's fundamentally a pine cone. Now within the pine cone, and they're large, this probably weighs about 3 kilos, and examples we've harvested this season particularly, some of them are up to, round about nearly 40 to 50 centimeters in height and about 30 centimeters in girth, and it's packed full of nuts. Now to get to those nuts, it's simply a matter of this scale system that forms the nut being broken apart. When we break the nut apart, it's formed of these shingles or scales, just like that, and each one of these contains a nut. There are some spacer ones that don't contain a nut, but that's fairly transparent and obvious when you get to those. Once we're in there, it's simply a matter of pulling that nut out, and then we have our literal Bunya nut. This is what we're after. This is the gold within this particular species. All of this material goes back to the forest floor, back to creating humus, back to conditioning soil and supplementing soil the way that all decomposing plant material does and should. This part goes into the food larder. Now these can be stored for a period of time, they can be fermented, they can be boiled, they can be dried and desiccated, but by far my preferred way of consuming them is simply to roast them in a fire. Now they're a contained seed, so we need to perforate the seed first, put it into the fire, and then cook it that way. Otherwise, they'll pop, they'll explode. They don't explode particularly aggressively, but they will still explode. So we need to just be careful with that when you're cooking these guys. The best ways to cook them, as far as I'm concerned, are in the coals of a fire. A lot of people prefer them boiled. That's fine too. And you can just either cut them open and cook them that way, just in a pot of water, and boil it with a bit of salt until they're soft on the inside, or you can roast them in the fire as well. They can be eaten raw. The main component of nutrition that we're interested in with this nut, and that the old people seem to be very, very aware of, is its starch content. It's somewhere between a roast potato type flavour and a baked potato type flavour, and consistency. A little bit firmer, but that starch content is a powerful source of carbohydrates. Beyond that, the nutritional properties of these nuts are largely undiscovered. So we still don't know the full profile of what it's potentially going to offer us as human beings. We know that it has an energy and a vibration that is high. Some of the essential oils we've just mentioned have been researched currently for their properties, but in the medicinal side of things. So we're focusing on food, and this is one of those incredibly rare bounties that you may encounter or have something similar in an area that you occupy and live in, or are traveling through, that occurs randomly or at a very distinct period of time. Remember the beginning of the course, we spoke about a lot of the traditional plant foods used by Aboriginal people in this country were periodically harvested. They weren't continuously present in the ecosystem. So there was a process of moving to an area like southeast Queensland from quite distant locations to harvest this particular nut. That speaks highly of its value. That massive journey, that massive expedition alone, travelling from quite some hundreds of kilometres away to this area to harvest these nuts when it was in a full fruiting season. And as a part of that, the traditional owners here used a lot of that time of gathering to do other community-related activities like marriages and catching up on the news and all the other stuff like that. Okay, so this tree has got a lot more to it than just the pure food componentry. So in terms of location, this is a subtropical species, and it's practically unique, bar some botanical research facilities or parks that may have acquired young trees over the course of the last 100 or so years. But this is its native territory, southeast Queensland. This is called Bunya country, and this is a classic example of where we have that really seasonal yield. This is different. It's a boon yield when it does yield, but beyond that, it's barren. The tree offers us little else beyond the food nut side of things because it's such a harsh tree. The leaves on this are very, very coarse, very spiky. Early pioneers, unfortunately, also found the timber itself very useful and cut them down. So we've got a limited number of trees now available to us. Although, every time we plant one of these and grow a new one, we're trying to redress that issue. So the bunya pine itself is what we define as an emergent rainforest or subtropical rainforest species. So you're not going to find it everywhere. But that's the nature of bush tucker, as we've clarified at the beginning of the course. And it's why I've broadened the lens on what I'm offering here on the course as wild food plants. Because this is probably something that few of you are going to encounter. Why have I included it in the course? Because it's just so incredible as a species and as a tree, and as a great example of some of that regional specialisation that we can tap into. Right? So the idea here, in terms of transferability, is find a species that's like that in your particular area. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, tap into what is regionally specific, seasonally specific in your area, and we use that lesson So the bunya here is teaching us a lot. I'm lucky. I've got these growing in my backyard, my front yard, and everywhere else that is in the yard space that I'm responsible for being a custodian of. And I continue to plant these every season for that reason. Part of the contract I have here with this particular piece of land. So as we look at the nut itself, here's one I've just cut open. You can see this white starchy center or kernel. Let me just dig that out for you. Now there's a small shoot here, just there that you can see coming through. That's edible too. And this material here is all edible, both, as I said, raw or cooked, roasted or boiled. Okay, so you end up with quite a sizable amount of food for the considerable effort it can take to get these guys out of their shell. So that's what you're looking at in terms of the yield from one nut, one particular nut. Now in that section of this nut, there's already 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 odd portions that size. So as we continue to work through, we pull them out, we have our larder of food increasing and expanding exponentially. A nut like that, for example, is probably going to contain somewhere in the order of 70, 80 individual nuts. Okay? And we can process that down. Now, in terms of long-term use, if we keep them like that, so out of this scale, they can be stored like this, either by drying and kept in an open, airy space whilst we're moving. So we can actually take some of this food with us. From a survival context, that's ideal. But also, we can do other things such as boil them, so get them into this state, boil them and ferment them or preserve them in other ways, desiccate them and dry them, as we said, dehydrate them. They can be made into a flour that way as well. If we dehydrate it and then grind it up into a flour, it can be consumed that way. So that's the bunya nut. Absolutely incredible plant, and I'm honoured to be able to share that with you today because it's a rare thing. As I said, it occurs in this area in this quantity basically once every 3 years. Now I've harvested, as an example, this year so far from foraging around the entire area, somewhere in the order of about 40 cones this size. Many of them we planted straight back into the forest for the next generation because this tree is one that's very rare, it's in crisis, and it's little known. So it's got a high potential to become rapidly endangered and lost to us. That's the bunya nut, guys. Enjoy.